welcome back. Good evening. We're just going to introduce ourselves. So my name is Sophia Yadong-Hao, and I'm from Scotland. I'm director of a Cooper Gallery, which is a part of Duncan Jordanstone College of Art and Design, University of Dundee. And I'm going to be in conversation with the artist, the filmmaker, and the writer Grace DeRucci, who's here with me. And so we're currently working together, developing a project for Cooper Gallery, which will open on the 9th of October, so a little bit self-promoting, which is a part of ongoing project called the Ignorant Art School, 5 Sittings Towards Creative Emancipation. So Grace is going on stage, the concluding sitting number 5, entitled Compassionate Rebels in Action. So that's just a very brief introduction. So we're going to start with a meditation led by Grace.
Yes, so I thought we could start with a meditation. I like to do this normally just because everyone's been rushing around and it's nice to get back into our bodies. So maybe if you can sit up straight and keep your body open with your hands facing upwards, your palms facing upwards. And let's begin to close our eyes and come back into the room. Begin to follow our breath, going in and going out. And not changing the breath, but we're letting the breath be natural, as it is. And as we let our thoughts pass by, without clinging on to them, we focus on our breath, going in and going out. And if the breath is long, let it be long. And if the breath is short, let it be short. Feeling our breath, feeling our energy, grounding into the soles of our feet. As the breath goes in and the breath goes out. Sensing ourselves in a room full of bodies being together in this moment in time. As our breath goes in and our breath goes out. Focusing on the silence for a few moments, the last few moments of peace as the breath goes in and the breath goes out. We open our eyes and come back into the room. Thank you.
A group of 30 people from different African and European countries were invited to join the performance by Grace De Ricci in the afternoon, when she asked us to take off our shoes, sit in a circle, and meditate together. The reactions were mixed. We later gathered in the museum's mineral cabinet, where Grace invited us to sit on the blank floor and close our eyes. Some of us may have previously done yoga or occasionally participated in a meditation session, but none had done so in the museum before. The sitting practice was followed by a silent walking meditation, where we were asked to move slowly with our eyes closed in a circle. This exercise demands a lot of trust and concentration, as we must adapt to the rhythm and the tempo of the person walking in front of and behind us. Grace spoke slowly, asking us to concentrate on our breath while trying to sense the presence of the accurately arranged exhibits in the freshly renovated showcases from the 19th century. Do the precious stones and minerals from Central Africa speak to us? Can we feel them and connect with their history? In most religions, walking barefoot is seen as a sign of spiritual devotion, of being detached from worldly needs. In Buddhist cultures, monks walk barefoot to protect and show concern for Mother Nature. In Judaism and some Christian denominations, it is customary to go barefoot while mourning. Mahatma Gandhi, however, connected the spiritual with the political purpose and walked hundreds of miles barefoot to lead his successful non-violent campaign for Indians' independence from British rule. But how do these two spheres, the spiritual and the seemingly political agenda of this museum intervention, complete and collide in Grace's work? So that was some passages from Jana Haeckel's text featured in Grace's book, Being Together, a Manual for Living. So this text recounts the workshop called Everything Passes Except the Past, which took place at the then newly reopened Royal Museum of Central Africa in Belgium in 2019. So given that historical context of the museum, so as we know, the horrific atrocities and exploitation committed by King Leopold II, to me there's a number of key points in this workshop Grace offered, such as a spiritual practice as a decolonizing method, and the role of a radical pedagogy in this, as well as the performativity as a political act, amongst others. So in the text, Jana also discusses Grace's intervention, which is a part of the performance series, Healing the Museum, that Grace had been developing since 2012. So the series came out of a need, I quote, to reintroduce non-rational methodologies to reactivate the sacredness of art spaces. So Grace, I have a question for you. So could you talk, just going back to the end of the passage I just read out, so could you talk about how the spiritual and the political agendas of your practice engender a critical and learning projects in terms of knowledge production and institutional practice.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I should give a little bit of background. By the way, I'm just showing projects that I thought were relevant to the whole talk. A few slides back, you may have seen people meditating in a space. This is the performance that was being quoted in this text that Sophia just read out. So this is in the African Museum in Belgium in 2019. So I grew up in an activist household, so a feminist household. My mother also studied the Truth and Reconciliation Studies. So spirituality and politics have always been part of my life, let's say. And I think also when I was very young, I was influenced a lot by the Dalai Lama. So one, in terms of going to India when I was a teenager, and hearing him talk about this thing called socially benefiting activities. And I had just finished art school, or was in art school, and I had understood, well, maybe art could be my socially benefiting activity, but the key would be how to not make it dogmatic or cliche. And then also the Dalai Lama had been co-organising this conference on art, science and spirituality, and economics in the 90s. Oh, I was a kid, but I'd heard about this conference. And so this idea of spirituality and politics working together made sense to me. And so in my own work, I'd started this project called Healing the Museum in 2012. And so this was because I felt museums were dying, because they were very disconnected with what was going on outside in the real world, politically, socially, energetically. And I felt that if I could reintroduce these non-rational methodologies like shamanism and meditation into the museum, working with the public, working with collections, working with the staff, then, you know, I could begin to kind of understand and see the museum in a new light. And so this example, so this was in the African Museum, and so this is in the gem and mineral room. So these are kind of blood diamonds, basically, minerals that were taken by the Belgians in Congo. And so my way to kind of bypass the normal discussions, because it was a closed workshop that the Goethe had begun, where there were like a group of African and European scientists, academics, museum directors, artists and activists. And we would go to different museums in Europe. Unfortunately, the British Museum did not want to take part. But we went to like Germany, Italy, Spain, France, Belgium. And we would have these conferences where we would argue about what to do in terms of restitution. And this had come after the Macron report in 2016. And so we know, everyone knows about that report where President Macron said he would send a certain amount of objects back. But it didn't feel like that was really happening. And then Angela Merkel wanted her own report. So, you know, this was the idea that we were going to go to these museums and discuss these things. So, but my way was to think about how we could bypass some of the normal, you know, conference situations where you just get stuck in, you know, in conceptual arguments, or when you're having to discuss like legal frameworks. I thought that at least if we had a kind of bonding moment, and that's what happened. So we did the meditation, and some of the African artists and activists, they got really upset because these are like from their country and they were like meditating. So then it was a very cathartic moment that we went through. So then when we would talk in the next, you know, the next session about legal frameworks or something, we'd already kind of began to bond as a group, you know. And so that's what Jana and the other people who had been in that experience kind of went through. And so this kind of unlearning, this was my way of intervening. And that's really got to do with my bigger idea of how to bring different types of people together. you know.
But I guess also, you know, in terms of decolonization, you know, in relation to museums practice, usually people would, you know, start bringing artworks by black artists or artists of color, or trying to interpret the objects.
Yeah.
But to me, decolonizing is not only about reinterpreting or presenting certain content. The process is really important. And then, you know, this phrase, praxis, and putting theory into practice. So it's not only, you know, replacing some objects on the shelves, on the walls with different objects, but, you know, reconsider how we do, how we work in the museum. So I think that's quite interesting to think about your idea of even the title, Healing the Museum. You know, you use a verb. All the time.
To do.
In your to do, yeah. So I think that's quite interesting. And also in the context of this conference, you know, what is research now? I remember years back, I was looking at the origin of research, and you know, research actually means to search. So this kind of a constant, continuous searching, I think that's already is kind of alternative way of doing things rather than present the final results.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I also wondered. It's quite interesting to think about the workshop title. It's called "Everything Passes Except the Past."
Yeah.
So when I was preparing our in conversation, that title of the workshop really reminded me Aurela Aisha Azoulai's very stimulating book, Potential History and Learning Imperialism. In that book, she asks people to reconsider the concepts of the past. And she even called for, you know, if the past was the invention of the Imperial Archive. You know, I know just now I think the other speakers talk about archive, the concept of archive. And then Azoulay talks about maybe we should have stepped back from this idea or notion of archive completely. You know, she talks about this idea of disengaging from the position of the explorer historian, but engaging in the present continuous mode with those considered the past. So if we stopped thinking about history, the past, or archive in a kind of a linear mode, then the past is never past.
Yeah.
So I just found that the title of the workshop is really inspiring in relation to you know, research, archive, and history. And in terms of bringing the spirituality into the whole process, you know, this is just the, you know, at the moment I'm thinking, do you think people's attitude, because of Jana's text, people's attitude shifts from decades ago when you first started this?
Oh yeah, because when I first started, and when I was at art school, and you know, I would go and meditate, because you know, from a young age I was already doing many spiritual practices, and I had a guru, and I'd going on these retreats, and then in art school, like people didn't, you know, I would get a bit bullied for like doing yoga and meditation and things, and so yeah, that's really obviously shifted in the mainstream culture. You know, so now if I go to Goldsmiths or whatever, everybody's meditated or at least tried yoga. So it's just such a, you know, and it's such a contrast from when I was teaching meditation there in 2009, and everyone was like, okay, what is this, you know? And so that's good in a way, but then you have to be careful, obviously, with this idea of spiritual materialism, you know, and institutions or, you know, corporations, you know, and their obsession with wellness, you know, and thinking that is a key factor, and, you know, them divorcing actually a lot of these techniques, powerful techniques, from actually their history, you know, and their lineage, and because energetically then you're actually making something into a kind of a medical thing, like mindfulness is a medical solution for depression, but actually that's got nothing to do with what mindfulness really is, you know, and these kind of very powerful meditation techniques that have been around for thousands of years have got nothing to do with psychology or depression, you know, that's a nice side effect. But like in the West, there's this kind of compartmentalizing, and then you get this idea of spiritual materialism. So it's about battling that, you know. And in my own practice, I mean, I decided, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or whatever, on my website, I put 2 CVs. So you have my art CV and you have my spiritual CV. And so you can see I guess in terms of research, you can see how I've grown over the decades, you know, simultaneously in both these paths. And I think that helps people to understand that it's a genuine thing. It's not like a fashion thing, you know, whatever.
Exactly. That's also, you know, talks about the idea of knowledge, the definition of knowledge, what's considered knowledge, how we challenge this assumption of knowledge in a present continuous mode.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to read another passage, which is actually related to what we just talked about. Progressive, conservatives, minoritized groups, and the majorities alike, our collective capacity to be together seems to have atrophied in recent years. Further and further boxed in by the echo chambers of social media. Designed for attention span extraction, these platforms seamlessly deliver content that comforts rather than confronts. Once challenges are ranked away for the sake of profit, news and opinions easily coagulate in ground thinking, or group thinking, resentment, and ultimately conspiracism. Yet divisiveness is not a byproduct of profit making. It is rather its source. Without haves and have-nots, there would be no wealth accumulation. Thus, late capitalism benefits from a society scattered in an archipelago of inward-looking communities, immediately confirmed in their grievances. The rise of political extremes could not happen without the tacit approval of techno-capitalism. So that's a passage from Sebastian Tien in the epilogue of this book, which I think offers us a kind of quite bleak, but an impression of the broader social and the political landscape we are having to deal with. He later on also mentioned the experiments of being together that Grace have been practicing through different art projects for over decades. And he describes this being together acts as a mode of resistance. So for me, being together finds its cogency as a process, as I already kind of commented on earlier. And to me, it's more of a becoming together than being together, which is a holistic trajectory embedded in and embodied by situations such as this sort of gathering events. So with that in mind, I'm quite curious to know what being holistic means to you, Grace. And do you think how or if that can help to address or ameliorate the problems Sebastian so eloquently put out?
Yes, thanks, Sebastian. No. No, it's actually a really good epilogue. This is actually the second edition of this book, and it's a new epilogue from this year, because I think it was good to update it because the book was first published during COVID. So, and that was obviously a time when we couldn't be together. That's why I called the book Being Together, a Manual for Living. But yeah, I guess holism, or being holistic, it comes from thinking that there's no difference in my art between art and life. So, in my own life, I've lived, off-grid. I've lived in a lot of spiritual communities, indigenous communities. And then that has obviously, since I was a child as well, going to these types of communities or, different types of alternative situations, let's say. And that's obviously influenced my idea of what it means to be with people. So, like the chapters of the book, it's called Living Together, Eating Together, Feeling Together, Sitting Together, writing together, designing together. It's like many ways to be together. And that being a kind of radical statement, in a time where it becomes more difficult to be together because of technology, because of policing, because of, all sorts of reasons. And then also, I love architecture. So this is from a show that I did at SMAC, a survey show. This is my structure called The Temple. And so it's a wooden structure, and it's based on, and inspired kind of by my grandmother's adobe hut, but mixed with a kind of modernist design display structure, which means you can have objects on it, but also in the centre, there's a space for gathering and doing workshops and talks and having meditations. And this comes from me thinking about architecture as a type of spiritual technology, which means that in my exhibition design, I'm always thinking about holism and, being together. So in the choice of colours, of the carpet, or a lot of my shows are all shoes off. There's no wall labels. It's all about having audio meditation guides. So this feeling of wanting people to come in and relax and slow down. And it means that in my shows, quite often, people spend a lot of time, more longer than they would normally going to a show, because I try to create a safe kind of space. And this is because I have like this secret agenda, which is about, rebalancing everyone's brain. So, in the West, we're very stuck in this kind of left brain thinking and making decisions. And I always joke that, if Jung had been the teacher and Freud had been the student, we'd be living in a completely different world, because, we in the West, the right brain is being suppressed so much. And so in the kind of spaces I create in my art and my writing and things, it's about making that balance again. So you're creating room to come up with new ideas, and new ideas that are about kind of maybe solving bigger issues, So again, it comes back to, what the Dalai Lama talked about in the beginning, like these socially benefiting activities, or creating spaces of collectivity, And so, I think that connects with what you were asking. Yeah.
But also, I guess these type of communities, in Edward Said's words, he kind of talks about this idea of interpretive community, which a community is not established based on geographic locations or particular belief, but on kind of shared values. And then they don't have to be physically together, but then that kind of shared discourses and collectively developed discourse could always...
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing is, I'm always interested in what we've got in common. Okay, so it means that I've lived in places that many people in this room would never live in. So I lived in Texas for a year, you know, and Texas is a very Republican place, you know, and being a left kind of person in a Republican place, what do you do with that if you've got to live with people? So you have to try to find things in common, you know, and so trying to negotiate that and trying to see the bigger picture. This goes back to my original belief system in shamanism, and, you know, shamanism was practiced by all world cultures all over the globe on all continents, you know, you can trace it back, you know. So this is showing us that we did have something in common in the first place, you know, and actually genetically we have something in common, you know. So I'm less interested in, you know, polarizing things and trying to find, you know, the humanness in things, let's say. Yeah. But
it's quite interesting, you know, you're talking about shamanism. I did a little bit digging in terms of the original meaning of shamanism. It's actually from this language called the Evenkai people on the borders of Mongolian and Russian. Shaman originally means to know. So to me, that's quite interesting in relation to radical pedagogy as part of your practice. And it's not about presenting the existing knowledge.
No, because the shaman is the healer and the artist, you know, and it's got many different roles. It's not just one thing. So it's trying to, you see other worlds at the same time that you're in this world, and you try to bring that energy or that knowledge in, you know, but in my interpretation and use of shamanism, it's always, because I'm still aware that I'm living right now, so I try to use it as a tool to help the time now, even though the energy or, you know, some of it is coming from 50,000 years ago. Do you know what I mean? It's always, it's the context of being always involved in deep time, even though you're living in this reality, you know. So it's being aware of the different worlds at the same time.
Does that mean non-rational thinking is actually more exciting than rational thinking?
To me, but but I think it's that balance, isn't it? You know, that's what I was trying to say. You know, many of these systems that we're involved in, we can see that if you take rationality to the nth degree, we end up in a totally irrational system where you're not even able to see that people are people, they're just numbers, and it becomes inhumane, you know. So, you know, following rationalism is quite dangerous if you go that far, you know. So trying to create a space for these non-rational methodologies, as I call them, you know, is really important to me, yeah.
Go on, take a guess. I didn't know either. So Grace Ducci likes to ask people what they think the word cover slut might mean. The all caps branding of a cover slut copyright might steer you off course, but that's part of the humor, not least part of the politics. A cover slut is a historical word denoting a textile cover used to conceal the dirty aprons of kitchen maids in 17th century England. While the word has long since fallen from use, a regrettable part of it, slut, remains. And to be a slut is to be shamed for it. Historically then, to have required a cover slut was to be shamed for the dirt on your clothes, to be designated a dirty woman, further humbled for the indignity of your lower class. Feminisms and class politics are already embedded in this historical term, and perhaps we might draw a tentative line of relation through to today's invocation. I think here of the potential for recovery. As a queer theory has shown us, injurious words can be reclaimed, recycled, and celebrated. Without wishing to reduce practice to metaphor, this aligns with a common thread across Grace's work: revising, reimagining, and healing. So the question arises, if we now know what a cover slut is, what does a cover slut copyright stand for, and what of the relationship between them? In the simplest possible terms, a cover slut copyright is a fashion label, the People's Republic of Fashion, and to know, in its right on a more complex inference of nationhood. Yet why settle for the simplest possible understanding? This is to miss much of the open-ended processes and the complexities that characterize Grace's projects and make them so vital. Capitalism understands the power of the brand, and she was especially quick to establish and protect her own cover slut copyright. For her, big brands co-opt culture, radical ideas and positions, repackaging them into neat consumable items and selling them back to the masses for profit. Why not take this logic and subvert it for different ends? And why not have fun while doing it? Well, ostensibly, a fashion label, cover slut copyright, is as much a fashion and economic research project, which the artist began in 2018 and continues apace today. It is, at its heart, reparative practice, one which began with a raw material from capitalism, the mass-produced white T-shirt. Long since discarded, she repurposed these T-shirts with a new vision and a methodology in mind, transforming not just their materiality, but their value, their meaning, and ascribing to them a new outcome. So maybe, Grace, you could talk a little bit what exactly this cover slut copyright is.
Yeah, so Cover Slut is a fashion brand. I actually copyrighted in 2016. So as Edward Ball has spoken about, Cover Slut, it sounds like a very contemporary term, but actually it's a term from the 17th century, which I rediscovered, and, that's the name of it. But it was a brand set up on ideas of the politics of articulation and intersectionality. So where class, race, and gender are at the foundation. And it's also a kind of way of thinking about fashion as a tool to kind of play with ideas to do with economics. Meaning that when I started Cover Slut, it was a mixture of public art funding and also money from the Department of Work and Pensions. This was in Belgium. So I was mixing capitalism and then, getting these white T-shirts and printing them with texts from my book Dissent Without Modification, and then selling them as pay what you can, and then using that money to make ethical collections. So I created this kind of loop. And then what was fun, I would sell the same clothes as pay what you can in kind of like different types of spaces. So whether they were like youth centres or like museum bookshops or art fairs, or, we even did a pop-up shop in J.W. Anderson, which is like high fashion, but there was always this idea about having this kind of sense of humour where we were poking fun, because when I set up Cover Slut, I was interested in fashion as a teenager, and I kind of studied a bit of fashion and textiles, but the reason I didn't go into fashion is because it's not just because it's so elitist, but it's also because of this rhythm of having to have this spring, summer, autumn, winter. So Cover Slut was also about wanting to be embedded in a local community. So I would work with refugees and migrants and young artists to make the collection, and I would design these kind of group drawing exercises to come up with the, you know, some of the prints and things. And then I would also organise these kind of off-season different things. So I'd do like, this is one of them. So we'd do like a protest instead of a catwalk. This was like a mass protest with like 70 people without police permission. And it was really funny because it was right next to the, to the court. But because it was a bank holiday, the court was closed and all the police were on holiday. So we just did it anyway. So, and it was great because in the project I've been working with a lot of old, like, you know, Turkish ladies from 70-year-old Turkish ladies from small villages, and they were kind of, a lot of them were illiterate, but then I mixed, but they were amazing at embroidery, amazing at making, and then I kind of mixed them with some art students, and, you know, because art students think they know everything and about abstraction. So then when you put these two groups together, then you come up with these kind of, you know, so this is in the local community, and you know, they all invited all their families to come and do the protest as well. And this was after a year of working with them on different collections. So, you know, I even took them to Brussels Art Fair, and we had like a booth, and where we made the clothes in the booth, you know, and we had like models dancing, and, you know, but yeah, everything's paid, you know, everything's pay what you can. So it means that obviously in a fair, if collectors are buying something, they can pay like 50 euros for a t-shirt or 100 euros, whereas in the youth centre, you know, they can only pay 5 euros. So this is also playing with scale and things.
But this is also, for me, a typical kind of alternative pedagogical projects.
Yeah.
Because you kind of flatten this kind of hierarchy who knows the knowledge.
Exactly, because cover slip's really about questioning who has the right to be fashionable. That's also, you know, like, do only certain people have the right, you know, and especially with ethical and environmental fashion, because it's so expensive, you know, like, what is that saying, you know, because some of the women I worked with, they might, you know, want to buy ethical things, but they can't afford to. So, like, you know, it's a whole, you know, so it's about questioning that, but it's also about, you know, these kind of, you know, mass catwalks, or we would have like psychedelic movie night where I'd make a new psychedelic collection, and then we'd, you know, dancing them and then watch psychedelic movies, you know. So these alternative catwalks, I called them philanthropic binges. And this idea of, you know, this idea of philanthropy and like all these, you know, corporations or institutions, and, you know, how they use philanthropy. It can be in a genuine way, but can it also about being washing, you know. And so, like, calling an actual rave in a youth centre a philanthropic binge, you know, and then, you know, so it is my sense of humour, and sometimes that gets me into trouble. So I'll give you an example. During the British Art Show, so we had I was invited to show Cover Slut, so like some of the clothes, and some of the two best-selling T-shirts are one for women, which is alpha male. So it's like it's like a white T-shirt, and then it says alpha male, and women love this T-shirt, right? And then the other best-selling T-shirt is it's quite rude, okay? It's called Black Cock, okay? And it has the word Black Cock in very big letters, and I had come up with this idea of thinking about Black Lives Matter, and obviously it's such a serious subject, but I was thinking about how can we support black men, so I made this T-shirt, and then it was sold out and stuff, and then, but for the British Art Show, I'd put a display in the windows, and, you know, that was really, everyone was really happy with it and stuff, and then a neighbour complained about this. And so what was really interesting to see how the different institutions dealt with it. I have to say the British Art Show dealt with it really well. But one of the arguments it came down to that the word it wasn't cock that was offensive, it was the black with the cock. And so that was very interesting to understand that the sense of humour didn't translate, you know, into some people. And so when you think about, I mean, if you have a brand called Cover Slut, obviously, and you're, you know, working with it, you need to have a sense of humour. Okay, so I think that's also a strategy of mine, you know, is how to use text and writing.
I was just going to comment on that, because it's not only about the wordings and phrases on the Cover Slut T-shirt, but it seems language really plays a real fundamental role in your practice. Yeah. You're not only an artist, you're a writer too. Yeah. And I know you actually set up your own account as a freelance novelist on this very typical kind of platform called academia. Only researchers and academics would put their essays on. But also, I'm just thinking about, just in the context of the project we're working on, you know, language always plays a really important role in meaning making, hence knowledge production. Yeah. But then, you know, claiming, you know, using a very capitalist terminology to claim the ground back. And I think it's quite interesting. I can see these echoes the ethos of the concept of politics of articulation, actually discussed by Stuart Hall in many of his writings. You know, when people just bring together seemingly kind of disparate ideas, contexts together, and then to construct a new structure, and that could actually, a lot of time, become a site of struggle, but challenging the existing power. So that's what I see, you know, how you worked with language and creating this sort of a new meaning. I remember years back, when I was still as a student, I read this text by Eret Rogoff. One line always stays with me was that rethinking structure rather than adding information. And that becomes something quite important for me in terms of my research and in terms of this Ignorant Art School project, is bringing artistic thinking to shake or to challenge, to subvert the existing system of so-called knowledge. Because even the terminology, the term knowledge itself is quite interesting. It's something already known. So that's just a comment on the use of language.
I mean, that's why I like doing shamanic performances as well, because you can never control what's going to happen. You know, that's the point of them, isn't it? You can't know what's going to happen. Or in a meditation, you can't actually know. You know, you could do the same meditation for the next 50 years, and every day it will be different. So it's that, and it's the same like if you work with a group of people. You know, let's say the day that we did the protest or whatever, it could have gone totally well, and another day it could have gone terribly, you know, depending on who would be involved, the police, the weather, dogs. You don't know. So I like that element, because that makes it also you're in the moment. And, you know, and being in the now is really important, because that's powerful.
That's a very brave way of dealing with a practice. You know, it's a risk-taking, and you're actually welcoming the contingencies. And then I think our time's up. But I have another question. But I thought perhaps I would just read out this thing I discovered, just to share this piece of information. Maybe that says quite a lot. So in the prologue of this book, Being Together, Grace mentioned the inspiration from this 1960s and the 70s journal. The title of the journal, which is quite interesting, is called The Journal of the Society for Education Through Art. And then I did a little bit of research. And I found in 1972, this journal was advertised in an anarchist magazine. Oh no, in 1962. In the adverts, they said the society has as its foremost aim the establishment of education in art, which will develop the imaginative and the creative powers of children and adults. To this end, it seeks the cooperation of all who believe that art is essential to the everyday life of the community. That was in 1962. But coincidentally, on the same page, an unrelated article gives a definition of anarchism as a permanent revolution. So I found that this idea of a permanent revolution is really interesting, this kind of, and in relation to what we are talking about today in terms of research, is a continuous search and the desire to know rather than to learn the information that's already there.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can say something related to that, because to me that is what the universe is in a permanent state of becoming itself. It isn't a fixed thing, which means that we're in a permanent state, you know, and this permanent state of revolution, this is also connected to John Burge's idea about the nature of mass kind of demonstrations, that they're a kind of rehearsal for revolution. So, you know, this becoming one, you know, whether you think of that in a political way or spiritual, mental, you know, or physical way as a human race, you know, this is, you know, that is a permanent state of revolution, because you can never get to it, you know. And so the show that we're going to do in October, I'm trying to set up, it's like a solo exhibition, but it has different elements to it, because there's obviously the installation part, you know, but there's also, I've written this new book called Glossary for Art and Action, which is about how we, you know, can use certain terms and, you know, think about, you know, being together in terms of, and collectivity, you know. And so I'm also kind of designing this season for peace building, which I began in January in The Hague, and then we're going to, you know, continue this season of peace building in Scotland.
So that's part of the public event program.
So to me, because it's very important to keep going back to things, because it's not like you've obviously fixed the problem, you know. So this idea of being in a permanent state of revolution makes sense, you know, in some way.
And also I remember Deleuze in the interview, he said that if a revolutionist starts claiming to be a revolutionist, that means the revolution ended.
Yeah, that's good.
All right, okay. Do we have time for comments or
some questions? Anybody?
Just have one quick question. Brilliant presentation, Grace. Thank you. Just before the question, though, just an observation of a link between all the presentations today. So first we saw Shiraz and his work, and we saw the three sisters in the indigo waves, and it feels like that's like an image that we would have never seen. It's repurposed, it's brought back to us, given back to us from a source that would probably just be buried in some kind of archive. And then in Alberta's presentation, we saw Edward Colston, who people are dying to get rid of because of the horrific nature of this man and the toxic sort of association. Interestingly, many artists comment that it was a great piece of work artistically, but doesn't belong there. And we see in Alberta's film the taking down of that statue, and we'll probably see moving forward it put in a more appropriate place where it can be explained. And then finally with Grace's work, we see repair and restitution. And actually, I remember it was so familiar to me because I saw that at the Wellcome Collection and participated in the activity there. It was actually really brilliant. And here you take some photograph some photographs from the past that then gets put in a different context. And what might be seen as a controversial work of art and insulting to black culture is then, so I suppose the word is power. So the first one was empowering those three women, and the other two, you're taking away. It's a power distribution between the three talks we've had today, is distributing the power of an object and balancing it out. So the power I experienced looking at this work of art was that the welcome itself was saying, this is disgusting, and we've invited an artist to come and look at it and repurpose it and absolutely heal it. But then the question then, Grace, is short one for you.
Okay.
Having said all of that, you really intrigued us when you said you had the British Museum in mind as a healing place, which would have been absolutely brilliant. I took a group of students there, and the officials told the students this should be called anything but the British Museum because there's nothing British here. So my question to you is, what was the prescription and the healing, the therapeutic model you had for the British Museum? That's the question.
It was more because we were doing this 2-year Goethe project, and every other museum in Europe said, yeah, we wanted to be part of it, but not the British Museum. And so they all have the similar types of histories. They're all, museums built in Victorian age, using colonial collections. They've all got, objects that were stolen. So what was it about the British Museum that had such a kind of tough mental leap to want to be part of this conversation? So to me that was very interesting, and also what it meant was that in the group, every time the British Museum would come up with our conversations, everyone would look at me like I would have the answers for that. Like I would be like, no, I don't have the answers for that. But it was just fascinating that the rest of all the main countries in Europe were willing to examine themselves on that topic, but not the British Museum.
The German Cultural Ministry even quoted.
Yeah, so afterwards, because I wrote these essays called Healing the Museum and Ways of Seeing a New Museum Story for Planet Earth, that talks about how and why we value objects. So normally we value them monetarily, then culturally, then spiritually. And this is kind of affecting our mental health as humans, And so the German Foreign Ministry in the end ended up reading my essays. And, I've done a lot of work about influencing museum policy, talking at ICOM and, doing all sorts of things behind the scenes, let's say. And so in the end, if you read Merkel's report, the Benin report, it is way more hardcore than the Macron report, and it's much more about we're going to send 40,000 objects back, and because the way Germans are, they're so organised, they're literally doing it, and all the objects are coming from, whether it doesn't matter if it's a local museum, or, a small museum in a village, or it's a big museum, they're really on it. Because, and I appreciated that they took it, that they listened to me coming from this artistic point of view. But, my work is very interested in, yes, it can be deceptive because it seems funny or has a sense of humour or it's beautiful or it seems very simple, but actually underneath it seems to have an ability to affect some practical change as well, so that's key.
But also in your practice, you do embrace this social practice. So you don't just present the objects and the artworks. You always have this kind of action. Exactly, glossary for art and action, because it is. I still believe in beauty and aesthetics and stuff, but it's about bringing the two together in harmony, and that's why when I'm able to do bigger shows, then it gives me the ability to create the exact environment, through the exhibition designs, through all the way to maybe I work with the staff for a few months before we even present anything, or working with the public or working with the actual object. So you're trying to infuse different institutions on all levels, Thank you.
And go on. And
We're running quite late, but because we haven't had a chance to ask any of the online questions, we're just going to read out one of the questions online. Quick question, quick answer,
Okay.
and then I think we'll have time for people in the room to kind of continue the conversation over drinks downstairs. So there's a question online that says, Grace, you speak about non-rational space that sits within this world that we now live in, etc. You've lived in Texas, and the Texan mindset now take power with tech bros, binary thinking. Do you see your practice as a spiritual shield with which to resist the shift to dominance by male authoritarians?
Well, the tech bros have only, I think, moved there in the last 10 years because of Austin. So I lived there in 2014. I mean, America is a country of complete contradictions, isn't it? You know, so, but I've always been, up until very recently, I've always still had a lot of belief in America, you know, as not just as an ideal, because there are some amazing people there and amazing geographies and stuff. But yeah, what did you say? As a protective. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's just about, we do have to share this earth together. So it is about, you know, negotiating and trying to, like I said, find something in common. So, for example, when I lived in Texas, I didn't have a car. And so I lived in Galveston, which is an island in the Gulf of Mexico, not the Gulf of America. Okay, to be clear, it was the Gulf of Mexico when I lived there. And so it belongs to Texas, so it's an hour and a half from Houston. And so I didn't have a car, so I kind of had to rely on people giving me lists to go to the grocery shop on the other side of the island or whatever. And so I got to know all types of people. And so one of the things, for example, I would go to CrossFit to exercise, and in there, basically everyone was a Republican, and there was the sheriff, and his wife, and they would come to class with their gun barrel T-shirts. And so then I was there, and it was around the time when Hillary, you know, was going to run for an election or whatever, you know, and so that would be one of the topics in the class. And so then you'd have to break that down within the class while exercising, you know, and then, you know, but because you'd spend so much time together and like at barbecues and church and stuff, I would see these people also as people, you know. And so in Texas, what happens is people are, I think, are the most generous people I've ever lived, you know, as a culture. They're super generous people, right? But they vote opposite to their own generosity. It's very weird. So they vote very you know, Republican, but actually when you live there, they're more generous. And then, because I also lived in LA for a few years, and LA, they vote perfectly liberal and everything, but man, the things I've seen in LA, it's so, you know, it's so divided. You've got Koreatown, blacks, white, you know, no one's in, you know, crossing over. You've also got, like, I've seen so many homeless people and people crossing over bodies to get inside their gym, you know, because there's a homeless person and they need to go to spin class, so they'll just walk over the homeless person to go to spin. Like, so, you know, they vote correctly, but actually how they live is completely ungenerous. So, I mean, what can you make of that then? You know, so it's not black and white, I would say.
The title of our project is Compassionate Rebel.
Yeah, well, because there's compassionate rebels everywhere, aren't there, in all parts of society, you know, and it's not obvious who they are. So
for one of the curriculum class events, for one of the curriculum events, and Grace is going to ask everybody to write love letters to your enemies.
Yeah, this is a really hard thing to write a love letter to. It can be your enemies, like a person or an institution or a political ideal, or, I mean, whatever you think of as enemy, but it's a very difficult thing to do. But if you can do it, it's very cathartic. So Anyway,
Okay,
thank
we
you.
end on the notes of a love letter
Yes.
to our enemies.
Thank you.
Thank you.